It didn't come with a press release. No royal announcement. No ceremony. Just a quiet change buried deep within palace operations so subtle. Most missed it. But those inside Sandringham felt it immediately. A single decision that rewrote centuries of protocol. The estate managerants loyal to the monarch alone was suddenly answering to someone else. And that someone was Catherine. The question is, who authorized it and why was it kept so quiet? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For generations, Sandringham stood as more than just land or legacy. It was control, carefully guarded and fiercely protected. A place where authority was not shared but inherited, where every decision echoed the will of the sovereign and no one else. The estate manager was not simply an employee, but a gatekeeper of royal power. A figure bound by an unspoken oath that tied loyalty directly to the crown itself. And yet, something shifted. Quietly, almost invisibly. Conversations that once flowed with certainty began to hesitate, punctuated by uncertainty that no one dared to name out loud. Staff who had spent decades navigating the rigid hierarchy suddenly found themselves questioning it, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. At first, it was dismissed as a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, perhaps a temporary adjustment made for convenience. But the pattern refused to disappear. Instructions that once came from one direction now arrived from another, carrying a tone that was unmistakably different, calm, precise, and quietly authoritative. Catherine's presence, once perceived as supportive and distant from operational control, began to feel closer, more involved, more intentional. It wasn't loud, it wasn't confrontational, but it was undeniable. And that's what made it so unsettling. Those who worked within Sandringham understood something the outside world did not change inside the monarchy does not happen by accident. Every shift, every adjustment, every deviation from tradition carries weight. And this was not small. It was a fracture in a system designed never to bend. The estate manager, long considered an extension of the monarch's will, now found himself navigating a duality that had never existed before. Loyalty, once simple and absolute, was becoming complicated. And in an institution where clarity is everything, confusion is dangerous. Whispers began to circulate, not in open defiance, but in careful, measured tones behind closed doors. Questions lingered without answers. Was this sanctioned? Was this temporary? Or was this something far more permanent? Something that would redefine not just Sandringham, but the very structure of royal authority itself. Because if Catherine could step into this space, this protected, untouchable domain, then what else was changing that no one had yet seen? And perhaps the most unsettling part was not the change itself, but the silence that surrounded it. Buckingham Palace, so often quick to clarify even the smallest matters, remained completely still. No acknowledgement, no denial, just a void where answers should have been. And in that silence, speculation grew louder, heavier, impossible to ignore. Because in the absence of explanation, people begin to imagine, and what they imagined was far more profound than anyone was prepared to confront. This wasn't just about reporting lines or internal adjustments. It felt like the beginning of something deeper, something deliberate. A quiet repositioning of power that had been unfolding slowly, patiently, long before this moment ever came into focus. And for those paying close attention, the realization was chilling. This wasn't the disruption. It was the reveal. But what seemed like a quiet administrative tweak was, in truth, the opening move in a far more calculated strategy, one that had been building long before anyone realized. For years, she played the role perfectly graceful, composed, untouchable. But behind the polished smiles and public appearances, Catherine was studying, observing, learning. Every corridor conversation, every staff hierarchy, every unwritten rule. What if this wasn't sudden at all? What if this moment had been years in the making? Because insiders are now asking a dangerous question: was Catherine quietly preparing to take control long before anyone dared to notice? The truth, as it now begins to surface, is far more unsettling than anyone expected. Catherine's journey was never just about fitting into the institution, it was about understanding it at a level few ever do. While the world saw elegance and restraint, those within the inner circle began to notice something else entirely: a precision, a patience, a quiet awareness that suggested she wasn't merely adapting to royal life, she was mapping it, learning not just how it worked, but where it could be influenced, where it could bend. At first, her involvement seemed harmless, even welcome. She asked questions others didn't think to ask. She listened longer than expected. She remembered details that most would overlook. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, her presence began to shift from symbolic to strategic. Staff who once operated independently found themselves looping her into conversations. Advisors who had served the monarchy for decades began to consider her perspective not out of obligation, but because it carried weight. And that weight grew. Relationships became her quiet foundation. Not loud alliances, not public displays of influence, but carefully built trust with the people who truly understood how the palace functioned behind closed doors. Senior aides, private secretaries, operational staff who controlled the rhythm of daily royal life. Catherine didn't challenge them, she aligned with them. And in doing so, she positioned herself not as an outsider looking in, but as someone already inside someone who belonged in conversations that once excluded her. But what made this transformation so powerful was how invisible it remained to the outside world. Publicly, nothing changed. She remained poised, measured, consistent. The image never cracked, and that contrast, the gap between what was seen and what was happening beneath the surface, became the very source of her strength. Because while attention was focused elsewhere, Catherine was quietly expanding her reach, one decision, one conversation, one subtle shift at a time. There were moments small, almost forgettable at first, that hinted at something deeper. A suggestion that altered a staffing decision, a preference that redirected internal priorities, a presence in discussions that traditionally would have been off-limits. None of it seemed dramatic, none of it raised alarms, but together they formed a pattern that in hindsight feels impossible to ignore. And now, as the situation at Sandringham comes into focus, those earlier moments take on an entirely new meaning. They were not isolated. They were steps. Careful, deliberate steps leading towards something much larger. Because influence, once established, rarely stays confined. It expands, it tests boundaries, and eventually it reaches places no one expected. What makes this realization so powerful and so unsettling is that it reframes everything. This wasn't sudden. It wasn't accidental. It was built. Slowly, quietly, intentionally, and by the time anyone truly noticed, it was already too late to question it without consequence. Because Catherine was no longer just part of the system, she had become a force within it. And forces once set in motion do not simply stop, they continue, pushing further, reaching deeper, reshaping everything in their path. And yet, even as her influence grew, no one expected her reach to extend into one of the monarchy's most guarded strongholds, Sandringham itself. Sandringham isn't just an estate, a symbol of royal continuity, a place where power is preserved, not shared. For generations, it operated under one unbreakable rule: absolute loyalty to the monarch. No exceptions. No interference. So when Catherine's authority breached its walls, it wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. The kind of shift that doesn't just raise eyebrows, it sends shockwaves through the entire royal institution. To understand why this moment carries such weight, you have to understand what Sandringham has always represented. It is not governed by the same visible structures that define the monarchy's public face. It exists in a quieter realm, more personal, more controlled, more absolute. Decisions made there are not debated. They are carried out. Authority is not shared. It is embodied in a single figure, and that figure has always been the monarch. That clarity, that rigidity, is what gave Sandringham its power. And now, for the first time, that clarity has been disrupted. Within its internal structure, every role has always been defined with precision. The estate manager was never just an administrator. He was the executor of royal will, the one who ensured that every instruction aligned perfectly with the expectations of the crown. There was no ambiguity in his allegiance. It was singular, direct, unquestioned. And that is precisely why this shift feels so destabilizing, because it introduces something Sandringham was never designed to accommodate: divided authority. Those who have spent their lives working within this system feel it more acutely than anyone else, not because they resist change, but because they understand its implications. When a structure built on certainty begins to show signs of flexibility, it doesn't simply evolve, it risks unraveling. And this change, subtle as it may appear from the outside, strikes at the very core of what Sandringham has always been: a sanctuary of control, a place untouched by external influence. Until now. What makes Catherine's involvement so significant is not just that she has entered this space, but how she has done it. Not through declaration, not through confrontation, but through quiet authority that has somehow been accepted, even if not fully understood. And that quietness is what makes it so powerful. Because it bypasses resistance, it avoids direct challenge, it settles in before anyone has the chance to question it. But not everyone is comfortable with what this represents. Among traditionalists, those who have long believed in the sanctity of established roles, there is a growing unease. Not openly expressed, not formally acknowledged, but present, lingering beneath the surface. Because if Sandringham can be influenced in this way, then what remains untouched? What boundary is truly secure? And more importantly, what does this mean for the balance of power that has defined the monarchy for generations? This is no longer about a single estate or a single decision. It is about symbolism, about what Sandringham stands for and what it might become. Because control over Sandringham has always been more than operational. It has been deeply symbolic, a reflection of who holds true authority within the royal structure. And now, that symbol is shifting. And perhaps that is what makes this moment so profound. It doesn't announce itself as a revolution, it doesn't demand attention, but it changes something fundamental all the same. Quietly. Irreversibly. The kind of change that only reveals its full impact once it is already complete. If Sandringham represented the monarchy's past, then this move suggested something far more unsettling: a deliberate attempt to reshape its future. No formal decree, no public acknowledgement, just a directive quietly delivered, impossible to ignore. The estate manager was no longer reporting to the king. Instead, instructions now flowed through Catherine. Staff were stunned. Some refused to believe it. Others feared what it meant, because in royal circles, power isn't just given, it's taken. And this looked like a takeover happening in real time. It began in a way that felt almost routine, which is perhaps why it took a moment for the weight of it to truly land. A message passed along the internal chain. Calm. Direct. Lacking any sense of ceremony, yet carrying undeniable authority. Those who received it read it twice, then a third time, searching for clarification that wasn't there. The wording was precise, but the implication was enormous. From this point forward, operational updates, decisions, and reporting would be directed through Catherine. Not alongside the king, not temporarily, through her. For some, disbelief came first, a quiet refusal to accept what seemed impossible. Protocol like this does not simply change overnight, not without explanation, not without acknowledgement from the highest level. And yet, no such acknowledgement came. There was no follow-up, no correction. only the steady, unsettling realization that the instruction was not being challenged. It was being followed. Senior staff, those who had spent decades navigating the intricate layers of royal hierarchy, found themselves caught between instinct and obligation. Their experience told them this was unprecedented. Their position required them to comply. And in that tension, something began to fracture. Conversations grew cautious. Words were chosen more carefully. Because no one wanted to be the one who questioned a shift that might already have been sanctioned at a level they could not see. Others reacted differently. Not with denial, but with quiet concern. Because they understood what this meant beyond the surface. Reporting lines are not administrative details, they are the architecture of power. Change them, and you change everything. The balance, the influence, the direction of decision-making. And here, that architecture was being altered without explanation, without context, without warning. Questions began to circulate, but they rarely found answers. Was this temporary, a measure taken for convenience, perhaps during a period of transition? Or was it permanent, a new structure being put in place without public acknowledgement? The lack of clarity only deepened the unease. Because in an institution built on certainty, ambiguity is not just uncomfortably, it is destabilizing. And then came the divisions. Subtle at first. Almost invisible. Some chose immediate alignment, adapting quickly, treating the shift as inevitable. Others hesitated, not out of defiance, but out of uncertainty. And in that hesitation, lines began to form, not openly, not dramatically, but undeniably. A quiet separation between those who accepted the new direction and those still trying to understand it. But beneath all of it, one question refused to stay buried. Who had authorized this? Because moves of this magnitude do not exist in isolation. They are permitted, enabled, or at the very least, allowed to happen. And the absence of resistance from the highest authority only made the situation more complex, more difficult to interpret, more dangerous to ignore. Because if this directive had been issued without approval, it would have been corrected immediately. But it wasn't. It remained. It settled. It became reality. And that reality carried a chilling implication. This was not confusion. This was not a mistake. This was a shift that had been accepted, whether openly or silently. And once accepted, it could not easily be undone. But behind this sudden shift lay an even more unsettling question: was this Catherine's move alone, or part of a deeper, coordinated plan? Inside palace walls, loyalty is everything. But what happens when loyalty begins to fracture? As Catherine's authority expanded, not everyone welcomed it. Quiet resistance began to form. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Eyes watched. Trust eroded. Because this wasn't just about Sandringham anymore, it was about control, influence, and a future that suddenly felt uncertain. And in the shadows, alliances were shifting in ways no one could predict. At first, the divide was almost invisible, hidden beneath the surface of routine and politeness. But tension has a way of revealing itself in the smallest of moments, in pauses that linger too long, in conversations that abruptly change direction, in the subtle shift of tone when certain decisions are discussed. Those who supported Catherine's growing authority framed it as evolution, a necessary adaptation in a monarchy that could no longer afford to remain rigid. But others saw something very different. Not evolution, not progress, but disruption, dangerous, untested, and potentially irreversible. Among senior figures, the discomfort ran deeper. These were individuals who had dedicated their lives to preserving a structure built on clarity and tradition. They understood hierarchy not as a suggestion, but as a foundation. And now, that foundation felt unstable, not shattered but shifting. And in an institution where even the smallest imbalance can have far-reaching consequences, that shift was enough to create unease that no one could fully articulate. Emotionally, the strain began to show. Long-serving insiders, once confident in their roles, found themselves navigating uncertainty for the first time. Decisions that were once straightforward now carried unspoken weight. Every action felt observed, every choice quietly evaluated. Because no one knew exactly where the boundaries now lay or who ultimately defined them. And that uncertainty didn't just challenge authority. It challenged identity. Loyalty, once clear and unwavering, was becoming something far more complicated. Some chose silence, not out of agreement, but out of caution. They adapted, adjusted, complied outwardly at least, because survival within the palace has always depended on knowing when to speak and when to remain still. But silence is not the same as acceptance. Beneath it, questions continued to grow, doubts lingered, and in the absence of clarity, speculation filled the space. Others, however, resisted in quieter ways. Not openly, not in ways that could be traced or confronted, but in hesitation, in delay, in subtle refusals to fully embrace the change. It was not rebellion, it was something more complex. A quiet assertion of doubt. A refusal to completely surrender to a shift they did not fully understand. And then there was the deeper conflict, the one that extended beyond individuals and into the very identity of the monarchy itself. Tradition versus transformation. Stability versus adaptation. The old guard, shaped by decades of consistency, now faced a reality where that consistency could no longer be guaranteed. And the question that haunted them was simple, yet impossible to answer. If this change continues, what will remain of the system they have spent their lives protecting? Because this wasn't just about Catherine. It was about what she represented. A new kind of authority. One that didn't rely on title alone, but on influence, strategy, and quiet control. And that kind of power doesn't announce itself, it expands, reshaping everything around it before anyone can fully grasp its scope. The fear, though rarely spoken aloud, was undeniable. If Sandringham could change, if reporting lines could shift, if authority could move without declaration, then what came next? What other structures, once thought unshakable, were already beginning to bend? And as the palace adjusted to this new and uncertain reality, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a single shift. It was a transformation in motion, one that was beginning to touch every corner of the institution. And as tensions rose behind closed doors, one critical question began to dominate every whispered conversation. What did the king really think of all this? In a monarchy, silence can be louder than any declaration. The king said nothing. No confirmation. No denial. Just silence. Was this quiet approval, a strategic retreat, or something far more troubling, a sign that control was already slipping away? Because if this decision wasn't challenged, it meant only one thing. The balance of power within the royal family was no longer what it seemed. At first, many believed the silence was temporary, a calculated pause before clarity would arrive. After all, within royal tradition, timing is everything. Words are chosen carefully, and sometimes not speaking at all is part of a larger strategy. But as hours turned into days, and days into an uneasy stretch of unanswered questions, that silence began to change shape. It no longer felt controlled. It felt heavy, loaded with meaning that no one could quite define, yet everyone could feel. Inside the institution, interpretations began to divide. Some viewed the king's silence as quiet endorsement, a sign that the shift had been approved at the highest level, deliberately left unspoken to avoid public scrutiny. Others saw something more fragile beneath it. Not approval, but hesitation. Not control, but a moment of uncertainty in a system that had always depended on decisiveness. And that possibility, however subtle, was enough to unsettle even the most seasoned advisors. Because in a monarchy, authority is not just exercised, it is perceived. And perception, once shaken, can be difficult to restore. The absence of a clear response created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, speculation began to thrive. Advisors exchanged careful words behind closed doors, weighing possibilities they would never dare voice openly. Was this a strategic shift in how power was being distributed? Or was it something far more concerning, a quiet erosion of authority unfolding in real time? The psychological weight of that uncertainty was impossible to ignore. For those closest to the king, the silence felt unfamiliar, uncharacteristic, almost disorienting, because leadership within the monarchy has always relied on clarity, on the reassurance that someone, somewhere, is firmly in control. And now, that reassurance was gone, replaced by ambiguity that lingered, unanswered and unresolved. Some began to worry about what this meant for the structure itself, not just in terms of decision-making, but in terms of symbolism. The king's voice has always represented stability, continuity, an unbroken line of authority that anchors everything else. When that voice disappears, even temporarily, it creates space, and in that space, other forces can rise, not necessarily by force, but by presence, by action, by filling the void left behind. And that is where the concern deepened, because Catherine was not silent. While questions circled and uncertainty grew, her role remained active, defined not by statements but by movement. Decisions continued, instructions flowed, and in contrast to the king's stillness, her presence became more pronounced, more tangible, more difficult to overlook. For some, this contrast was strategic, a balance between visible action and deliberate restraint. For others, it signaled something far more profound, a shift not just in roles, but in momentum. Because power does not always transfer through declaration, sometimes it transfers through absence, through the quiet acceptance of change that is never formally acknowledged, yet fully realized. And perhaps that is what made this moment so deeply unsettling. Not what was said but what wasn't. Not what was confirmed but what was allowed to continue without resistance. Because in that allowance, in that silence, something fundamental began to shift. Something that could not easily be reversed. And as the weight of that realization settled in, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a question of possibility. It was already happening. But if the king's silence raised questions, Catherine's next moves would raise something far more dangerous: certainty. This wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was precise. Every move Catherine made began to form a pattern that pointed towards something far bigger than Sandringham. Control over estates, influence over staff, authority without announcement. It all led to a chilling possibility. Catherine wasn't just adapting to the system, she was rewriting it. And once that realization set in, there was no turning back. What once appeared as isolated decisions now began to align, revealing a structure beneath the surface that had been quietly taking shape for far longer than anyone had realized. One adjustment here, one presence there. A voice included in conversations where it had never been before. None of it felt disruptive in isolation. But together, they formed a trajectory clear, deliberate and undeniably strategic. Catherine was not reacting to change, she was directing it. The significance of estates like Sandringham suddenly took on a new dimension. These were not just properties or traditions, they were centers of influence, places where operational control translated into real authority. Whoever shaped decisions within them was not simply managing logistics, they were shaping the rhythm of the monarchy itself. And by stepping into that space, Catherine had positioned herself at a point where symbolic presence evolved into tangible power. This was the shift that few had anticipated. For years, her role had been defined by visibility, public appearances, ceremonial duties, a carefully maintained image of composure and grace. But now, that image was being complemented by something far more substantial. Decision-making, oversight, direction. The kind of authority that doesn't need to be announced because it is already being exercised. And perhaps what made it so effective, so difficult to challenge, was the nature of how it unfolded. This was not power taken through confrontation. There were no declarations, no moments of open defiance. Instead, it was built through consistency, through presence, through a steady expansion that felt almost natural until it reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. This was soft power in its most refined form, quiet, patient, but ultimately, dominant. Inside the palace, the realization came slowly, then all at once. Patterns that once seemed coincidental now felt intentional. Decisions that once appeared minor now carried greater significance. And those who had been closest to the shifts began to see the larger picture that suggested this was not a series of adjustments, but a coordinated evolution. The emotional weight of that realization was impossible to ignore. For some, it inspired confidential belief that the monarchy was adapting, becoming more responsive, more modern. But for others, it triggered something far more unsettling. Because evolution implies change, and change implies uncertainty. And within an institution built on continuity, uncertainty can be the most destabilizing force of all. There was also an unspoken acknowledgement that once this kind of shift reaches a certain point, it cannot simply be reversed. Authority, once established, tends to reinforce itself. It expands, deepens, becomes part of the structure it once challenged. And that is exactly what this began to feel like, not a temporary deviation, but a permanent redefinition. Because Catherine was no longer operating within the system as it had always been. She was shaping what that system would become. And that realization changed everything. It reframed every decision, every silence, every moment that had led to this point. Nothing felt accidental anymore. Nothing felt isolated. It all felt connected. And as that connection became clearer, one final truth began to emerge. This was not just about control over an estate or influence over staff. It was about direction, about where the monarchy was heading, and who would ultimately define that path. And as the pieces fell into place, one final question lingered: what would this mean for the monarchy itself? The monarchy has survived wars, scandals, and revolutions, but this feels different. Because this isn't an external threat, it's an internal evolution. One that challenges centuries of tradition without ever announcing itself. Catherine's quiet rise has already changed the rules. The only question now is how far it will go and whether the monarchy the world once knew still exists at all. What began as a subtle shift inside Sandringham now echoes far beyond its boundaries, touching something deeper than protocol or structure. It reaches into the very identity of the monarchy itself. Because power within this institution has never just been about decisions, it has been about perception, symbolism, and the delicate balance between what is seen and what is controlled behind closed doors. And now, that balance feels different. Not broken, but undeniably altered. For the public, much of this remains invisible. The image of stability still holds. The rituals continue. The appearances remain polished, reassuring, familiar. But beneath that surface, something far more complex is unfolding. A transformation that does not rely on grand declarations or visible disruption, but on quiet, consistent change. And that contrasts the calm exterior against the shifting internal reality is what makes this moment so powerful and so difficult to fully grasp. Inside the institution, however, the weight of this change is impossible to ignore. Those who have dedicated their lives to preserving tradition now find themselves standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. Not a collapse, not a crisis, but an evolution that challenges everything they once understood about how power is held, how it is exercised, and who ultimately controls it. The old boundaries, once so clear, now feel less defined. And in their place, something new is emerging. This shift also signals something symbolic, perhaps even irreversible. For generations, authority has been tied to position, to lineage, to a structure that left little room for reinterpretation. But now, that structure appears more fluid. Influence is no longer confined to title alone. It moves differently. It operates through presence, through strategy, through an understanding of the system that allows it to be shaped from within rather than commanded from above. And that realization carries both promise and uncertainty. Because while change can strengthen an institution, it can also redefine it in ways that are not immediately clear. Those within the monarchy feel this tension most acutely, pull between preserving what has always been and adapting to what is becoming. It is not a simple transition. It is emotional, complex, and at times deeply unsettling. There is also the question of what comes next. Because change, once set in motion, rarely stops at a single point. It expands, it deepens, it reaches further than expected, and if Sandringham was the first visible sign, then it may only represent a fraction of a much larger transformation still unfolding behind the scenes. The most profound part of this moment is not what has already happened, but what it suggests about the future. A monarchy that is no longer defined solely by tradition, but by its ability to adapt. A structure that is no longer rigid, but responsive. And at the center of it all, a figure whose influence continues to grow, not through force, but through quiet, undeniable presence. And perhaps that is the final shift, the realization that the monarchy is no longer what it once was, and may never be again. Not because it has fallen, but because it is changing in ways that cannot be reversed. The rules have been rewritten, the balance has shifted, and the future, once predictable, now feels uncertain in a way it never has before. Because if Sandringham was only the beginning, then the real transformation of the monarchy may still be unfolding, just out of sight. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.